Hello everyone, today we talk about Georgian warfare between the 11th and the mid 14th century, roughly. It's the first time we talk about this region, and we address it introductively for other, for opening the path to other videos dedicated to Georgian military organization, tactics, troop typologies, and so on. Right, so we're looking at this area that is fundamentally related from a linguistic point of view to the nomadic islands north of the Caucasus. There was a lot of commixtions from the two sides of the mountains. The Georgians during this period would expand right to an important degree, so reuniting great part of the lands. In fact, in southwestern Caucasus and extending even across the mountains and surrounding region their influence, and eventually the Mongol invasion occurred. So lots of interesting insights that we could draw. The Georgians had originally been divided into two major groups, right? Those of Iberia and those of Lazica. So respectively in good measure the continental and the sea part on the Black Sea. And with the Abbasji, the Abkhazians, forming also a third related group, right? So this area, this wide area, had the Georgians inhabited in the medieval period was far more consistent than the one of the Armenians, for example, in the east, albeit the borders of the Georgian state itself fluctuated considerably. Right, we can't talk specifically about of a central state or something. Let's say more compactly. Let's say this is mostly a feudal time where these regions had received important influences from surrounding states, but they had never quite been a unit on their own, and therefore their power was developed alongside mostly private dynamics, and it was also rarer for Georgians to play a major military role outside their own territory, which is connected exactly by this. I mean, there were different houses fundamentally controlling their own surroundings, and having difficulty to be politically cohesive at the point of really waging war in kind of an imperialistic fashion to subjugate systematically surrounding populations. Right, this fundamentally was based mostly on how in fact cohesive they would be politically, but that was not definitely the standard. Also, the local resources were probably not dramatically, exceeding, so that's another situation, and there were constant, threats as always that increased also over time. And like Armenia, Georgia laid under Islamic domination, right, throughout much of the early Middle Ages, right, which naturally meant a very decentralized position relatively to the caliphate, and a struggle that in here was used skillfully from the local princes to aggrandize themselves, to side with different powers in the area, and that they very much enjoyed, in fact, this decentralized role. Right. At other times, Georgia had been part of the same kingdom of Armenia. Right. So what we're looking at instead in our own period, high medieval times, is the immersion of Georgia, essentially from the 11th century, covering roughly the same area as its modern counterpart, right? So it would remain basically that. So from the eastern coast of the Black Sea to the watershed between the Black and Caspian Seas, right? And some way down the headwaters of the Kura River as well. And from north to south, it stretched also from the crests of the western Caucasus Mountains across the same valleys to include a small part of what is now northeastern Turkey. right? And again, these were mostly areas of influence, and it's difficult to draw a precise boundary, say, mirroring on it a direct political control of the whole system as such. And there were, so these are fertile, virtually subtropical coasts and valleys that lay at one extreme of medieval Georgia, while the rugged and almost as lush high valleys on the Caucasus lay at the other, right? So there is some important also difference within the same country, and how this would impact the same development of political and social structures. And by the 10th century, we are told that Georgian cavalry made an effective use of javelins, right? And scholars have agreed largely on the fact that such mounted warfare resembled pretty much the one of the neighboring Islamic regions, right? I have, let's say, I don't have a doubt about the fact that they were very, very similar, but in general, it's always important to believe that, the world was pretty similar at the time. So it's not necessarily, a matter of Islamic influence per se, right? And there is an evolution along the feudal pattern, right, with the 12th and 13th century, where Georgian cavalry is described as well armed and armored, right? And again, this is normally it shows by itself, generally speaking, at least the fact that this such information is provided, the idea of a decent wealth distribution among a large pool of aristocrats, fundamentally. So the capacity to field a cohesive force in terms of military quality, where cavalry and also its armored element had an important role. And Georgians are also recorded being capable of fighting on foot, and they made, of course, also use of horse archery. And perhaps under Alan or later Turkish influence, right? And some scholars say that in the late 12th and early 13th century, horse archery may have been somewhat maybe a princely pastime rather than a serious combat skill on a large scale, fundamentally. I believe, honestly, that the role of horse archery in the region has been underestimated. If anything, probably for everybody living there, right? We don't need to think only of an external influence, such as surely the Alan or the Turkish one was very much about horse archery in many ways. But it's probably the region that historically had an enormous deal of steppe and also Persian influence, let's say a broader Iranian influence. And even though Georgia was fundamentally a sedentary country, right? And so it didn't, it didn't have quite the same, north of the Caucasus was already different. The islands surely had maintained, in spite of their gradual sedentarization, kind of a more evident, even if anything, contact even with horse archery further in the north. That's why I had kind of like that. But properly Persian culture, right? Even the Turkish influence in itself surely brought in the Caucasus, in Anatolia, in the Middle East in general, a big deal of Central Asian style horse archery, and properly the mass of horse archers in the regard that were literally settled here and there, right? Here we don't have time to descend in the details, but it's obvious that as you see, by the 11th century, the collapse of Byzantine Anatolia and the settlement of so many peoples, among which there weren't just Turks, actually. And there were also Georgians. We know that, the areas were that fluid, that unstable in a sense. So we have always to reflect on how permeable these military cultures had always been, historically, right? Before we were talking about the essentially the watershed from between the Black and Caspian Seas, and essentially the latter being a historically Persianized area, right? Think about Azerbaijan and so on, and the same Caucasus had been since ancient times. Think about the Achaemenid Empire, then the Hellenistic culture, but still the Parthians, the Sassanids, and so on. So those were areas that had also remaining decentralized from the Caliphate later on, had always been quite permeated by steppes elements, right? So horse archery even in the sedentary, this is evident also in Armenia, for example. And since an early age, it was fundamentally a sedentary civilization, but it had unavoidably an important amount of horse archery to deploy, right? And this came for imitation, for contact, for hiring, right? There was an important sedentary base, but also room for horse archery in an important dimension, and archery in general. Right. At the end of the 13th century, for example, Marco Polo regards the Georgians as expert archers. Right. He doesn't make it explicit whether they would normally shoot on foot or from horseback, but it's also kind of a known problem. Like if you have skilled archers, it's because yes, there is a difference in technique, in training, and even in mindset, in background, from say a guy who mostly just operates on foot like a normal agriculture, etc., and somebody who who has a more step-oriented mentality and lifestyle and so on horseback and so on. But in practice, like this is something that we've seen so much in Western Europe at the same time, right? Every aristocrat knew how to hunt, to bow hunt on horseback, right? So if in all these military cultures, and especially these ones where like if you want, the structural difference between cavalry and infantry is not so marked like in the West, where cavalry is really getting very heavy and infantry kind of subordinated to it. There was probably a flexibility, right, that read in this sense actually a greater amount of people who would actually fight for necessity on horseback with a bow, because the lighter, right, cavalry, say the less feudal the system is, that the more light cavalry you're going to find. So before we were saying an important, let's say, well armed and armored troops, but and there were surely very heavy Georgian cavalrymen, but at the same time we think in general that these areas resembled, in fact, pretty much the surroundings. So these are regions where that, as we just said, hadn't reached the same structural and deep feudalization, professionalization that we witness in the West. So it's a bit like the Byzantines or the Turks. Of course, they had very good heavy cavalry, but they would just make use of large amounts of horse archers at the same time. And frankly, even if we don't have a direct evidence of this dramatic horse archery skills in Georgia, well, it doesn't mean much, because from the 11th to the 14th century, you don't really have an overwhelming amount of information on Georgia at that point, right? So it's not so strange, right? And when you look at the surrounding peoples, they're all kind of made use of it. Well, you say, of course they made use it the same way, right? You can't see there's such strong cultural resistance to that, because it doesn't really make much sense, right? Those territories also could be quite impervious. There are some parallelisms even in other areas of the for example, in the Balkans, there are certain cultures that are more sedentary ones where they are exposed to horse archery, fundamentally developed a counter, missile capacity among the infantry as well. So surely also Georgia had probably good and especially numerically consistent amounts of foot archers. And it seems that archery was something there in the first place, right? And this is actually a very common documentation problem about, non-strict, narrowly meant Western countries where, In fact, sources are more scattered. Probably the societies had less of a middle class to produce certain more kind of scientific, say, large-scale amount of information, right? So we see a traditionalism as much as we could see, I don't know, in the Byzantine world or even in part of the Islamic ones indeed. And when we could know more about this original native style, let's say, by the early 14th century, we instead acknowledge what happened to many countries around, that is a much stronger Turco-Mongol influence, right, in Georgian warfare, because naturally the Mongols had arrived there as well. They had brought with them this broader wave of steppe military culture with it, and this is quite evident, right? It's probably also a reason of imitation. They were the new masters, right? After the destruction of Baghdad, the whole Islamic world was, let's say, permeated by this new model, in a way, and this was, a factor of further destabilization, by the way, in the region. The Mongols came to rule properly, and this injected in the local countries kind of a greater, even a further privatization, right? Probably an ever greater aristocratic military ethos that was much more firstly privatistic in mindset, right? And if these areas had any development of, I don't know, middle classes that could stem, part or counterbalance the rise of aristocracies, these things were fundamentally wiped out in a way, and it turned to be, if you want, even more feudal in nature, right? And the Caucasus had been an important feudal area. There was probably an equestrian culture together with horse archery, actually, which is not a surprise, but probably of heavy cavalry in some regions. Armenia shows it as well. Georgia surely had something like that, as we've seen. In spite of all, as we've seen, the comparative, say, less degree with the West, but still, it was also a mindset, right? Again, it was already kind of a private war before. This was reinforced at the time. We see, from, I don't know, for example, Asiatic quiver forms, right, which, by the way, was certainly designed for horse archery at that point, associated with the Georgians by a military author writing in Mamluk, Egypt, or Syria, right? Consider that Caucasus and also the lands in the north were at this point a great source of Mamluks, right, of slaves, well, for deportation, but sometimes also for voluntary, mercenary participation, let's say military service. And because these areas were regarded as somewhat tough, right, and the idea was a kind of qualitative individual consistency also from a physical point of view, that they were regarded as important pools for recruiting qualitative cavalry, like the one that could fundamentally emerge in the Mamluk military system. And in fact, lots of even people from all the surroundings, even Russians, etc., were were injected actually in places like Syria, Egypt, partly through slave trade, but again also from free mercenarism and so on, because it was an opportunity in that sense. And Mamluk Egypt naturally was growing as the most important power in the region in the first place. So we often underestimate how much Anatolia or Caucasus were actually influenced also by Mamluk Egypt. Albeit most of the influence would remain at this time from the in military affairs from the Ilkhanate of Persia. So again, Caucasus was more exposed to those. Of course, we don't have to underestimate the important Byzantine influence. At this point, the empire was reduced to much less than it had been before the Fourth Crusade. But let's say Georgian culture was, deeply soaked into, like, it's evidently in Byzantine style and so on, since a very early age, as as it had been part of the Roman Empire at some point even. So that is, if there was any misunderstanding, the most radical identitary model, if you want, right? There is something in common with Russia, with in fact the broader Orthodox cultural era. But when we speak, this is true, for example, also for Russia itself, that we see from iconography a lot of Byzantinisms, right? Even in post-Mongol times, where we know archaeologically that reality was very different, because they were basically Tartar in everything, like from a military point of view. But still, it's the model, right? It's the archetype that remains in art. At that point, that there is not even a distinction between religious and non-religious art, right? It's basically the same thing, just like it had been in the Byzantine world, right? So that had to stick to the models of orthodoxy. So this unchangeability, this continuity, traditionalism. But in practice, right, if we had even seen a Georgian knight by the 14th century, we would have definitely observed an enormous deal of Mongol customs there, and more, but quite consistently so, because it was a chance to also properly aggrandize the same elites through the same. So when you're going to find also the elite as the leadership, as what makes the difference on the field most of the times, or at least that maintains the others under, well, that is much more inspired to the Mongol autocratic model than anything. So we'll talk about Georgia also in later times, but for now we stick to this. Perhaps we could picture it in this way. There's a gradual transformation from maybe close combat, almost Byzantine style cavalry, to horse archery that, let's say, was in part compensated also by the need to recruit Western European mercenaries, right? So there was already by the early 12th century a need for the Georgian sovereigns to compensate eventually from a lack of indigenous heavily armored cavalry in the Western style. You know that in those centuries, the 12th especially, think about under the rulers like Manuel I, Comnenus, and so on, how many, but really many Westerners were in the Byzantine army, like never before, factually, and there had always been something like that, right? Even since, I don't know, Justinian's time, you see, thousands of Longobards allegedly fighting for the empire in Armenia, on the Armenian front, and so on. So there had, let's say, Georgia, as long as it remained in that sphere of influence, had always received a big deal of Western input, as well in the local military tradition, but it still was something different, and it's a bit what you see, in fact, in the same Byzantine warfare, right? That on the long run, it gets kind of westernized because the Westerners literally take over. Well, this didn't quite happen in Georgia, that at that point was paradoxically through the cut with Byzantine connection, at least, with the decline of Byzantine Empire, less Western contacts, right? So, but by the 12th, so before the Mongol invasions, by the 12th century, surely this widespread phenomenon of essentially settling heavily armored Western knights to compensate for the lack, maybe not much the lack of yes, maybe also from a strictly technical point of view, that there were certain things in Western arms and armor that weren't quite the same, like in these regions, but mostly countering the nobiliar power, because as we've seen, Georgia wasn't quite of a truly unitary, strongly centralized system. So there was an attempt, right, by the increase of resources in the High Middle Ages to achieve it through such settlements. Of course, Western influence had remained important, like in other areas, even in the Empire of Nicaea before Constantinople had been reconquered. Think about all the Akriti that of Western origin that you could find in Anatolia and so on. So people roamed around, and we tend to underestimate how much that is true. But the opinion I have on Georgian warfare, having seen a bit also the iconography and the archaeological finds, is that still the influence is quite markedly, aside from certain artistic license and surely the permanence of some kind of Byzantine style in probably in these people's identities and so on. There are, are influenced by Orthodox models and so on in visual arts and so on. There was a big deal of steppe influence as well, and Turco-Mongol, Persian at that point too, but which was historically there even before. Even if these powers like the Alans, the Georgians, etc., were sheltered, if you want, in the mountains, were in some niches that they profited from itself, especially Georgia, I would say. If you look at the powers around. So there was some conservatism, but also the impossibility to stem external influences, not just because of the obvious need to update, right, to adopt the best, if you want, of that kind of military styles, but also because there was no possible cultural resistance against, in a world that still very fragmented in itself, and that was very competitively kind of even internally struggling for creating something more compact, more concrete. So this is more or less what we get, right? Surely we don't find a great deal, I don't know, of infantry military culture. Here there is nothing like you see in Western Europe, for example, like strong bodies of well-equipped infantrymen that have right? Mostly it's a nobiliar warfare with surely an important amount also foot retinues and so on, but let's say that were more auxiliary function. Probably the Georgians were very good at skirmishing, right? They were capable of putting up a very effective hit and run tactics and strategies for that matter too. The use of the javelin in the beginning is quite eloquent. That by the 10th century, still I don't know. Also in Western warfare, still the knight had very often used its legs in a throwing function. But the broader picture is of course that was kind of more traditional in Caucasus than in other areas. The Caucasus by itself being properly also from the terrain, the climate, etc. It's peculiar, right? There had always been a big deal of very good infantries. Let's say this broader area of the Mashrek, if you want, that stretches from Anatolia to in fact to the Iranian plateau, right? And that's passing through the Caucasus, had always had good mountaineer infantries, for example, which means that there are communities that do not have a great deal of military organization on their own, but individually they were pretty tough and rough, right? So there was part of the reason why Georgia didn't develop into a super state or something, a major power at the time, was due to also this difficulty in really having a capillary control on all these communities, having properly a force that could be able to centralize in that fashion. But let's say venturing in these areas was definitely not particularly pleasant, right? And multiple peoples did so. In Insight, that's always the same story. Like if there are some peripheral areas that are not particularly productive, or they're decentralized, and thus they have a less of a political and strategical relevance. They are also, in fact, fragmented, etc. They're difficult to enter in. Like they're like a fix, and in fact the areas kept remaining like frontier areas for many. It's just at the expenses also of some local efforts to build something more stable. But these great waves like the Mongols and other important powers were to rise, like later on the Ottomans, but the same Byzantines at the beginning regarded these as foreign lands, and so they had also damaged the the possibility of having a local independent development that could produce an equally a military force on equal grounds, right? And it's quite eloquent. In fact, what we were saying before, that there isn't a big deal of Georgian military activity outside of their own borders, right? That's very, very, very eloquent in general, and that we know better than surely what was the composition of the armies and so on. But these are all things we will see in greater detail at some other point. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.